The UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs this week warned that at least 5 million people were teetering on the brink of starvation in Sudan, with communities in more than 40 hunger hotspots at high risk of slipping into famine in the coming months. A man-made catastrophe as the Council now seeks to halt the RSF's advance in El-Fasher, where 800,000 people are at imminent risk.
The focus in particular is on El-Fasher and the terrifying, horrifying and deteriorating situation there. Of course we've been following the situation more widely across the country, but at the moment the focus is on El-Fasher. We've been working very closely with our A3 colleagues, with Sudan, consulting widely across the Council. So we very much hope that this afternoon's vote will mean that we can take some decisive action and produce a Council product on El-Fasher and more widely then continue to look at Sudan.
El-Fasher is by no means the only hotspot in Sudan, with at least 150 people killed in an attack by rebel forces on the village of Wad al-Nur in central Al Jazeera state on June 5th, raising questions as to why the draft is focused only on arresting the situation in El-Fasher, 1,200 kilometers away, and not the entire country.
We've been following the situation in El-Fasher very closely, but we are not by any means losing sight of the terrible atrocities being committed across Sudan, the extreme difficulty of getting humanitarian aid into the whole of Sudan, but in particular into El-Fasher, the checks at the borders, the lack of visas, the risks to humanitarian actors. So this is a symbol, a signal of our commitment to the wider situation in Sudan.
The resolution demands that the RSF halt the siege of El-Fasher and calls for an immediate halt to fighting in that region. It demands that all parties ensure the protection of civilians and allow them to move within and out of El-Fasher to safer areas. It calls for the full implementation of the Jeddah Declaration of Commitments, including allowing unhindered humanitarian access. It demands that all parties comply with their obligations under international law, on UN member states to refrain from external interference which seeks to foment conflict and instability in Sudan.
Colleagues at UNICEF have received harrowing reports that at least 6 children have been killed and many more injured in the city since the 7th of June. Thousands of children, including those living in large displacement camps, are trapped in the middle of the increased fighting and are not able to reach safety. UNICEF urges all parties to immediately de-escalate the situation, allow the safe and voluntary movement of civilians, and ensure the protection of civilians, including children and women and civilian objects. Our humanitarian colleagues warn that the ongoing clashes in and around El-Fasher are taking a grim toll on humanitarian workers and operations. Yesterday, an aid worker for the NGO Relief International in Darfur died due to complications from a bullet wound sustained on the 1st of June. The staff member was shot while returning to the Zamzam displacement camp after transporting a patient to El-Fasher Maternity Hospital. He was the 6th aid worker killed in Sudan in the past 6 weeks. The UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs underscores yet again that in Sudan and in conflicts everywhere else in the world, humanitarians must be protected.
The UN also lamented the fact that the $2.7 billion humanitarian appeal for Sudan remained only 16% funded. Council resolutions in theory are legally binding on all UN member states. But as recently as March this year, this very council passed a resolution demanding an immediate halt to fighting in Sudan ahead of the month of Ramadan, which was entirely ignored, with little consequence on the warring parties. Actions that further exacerbate the dire conditions for civilians who are bearing the brunt of this man-made disaster. Sherwin Bryceby's SABC News, New York.